Tuesday, right? Tuesday? Hey, there we go. I went live and then immediately was like, it's Tuesday, right? And could not remember if it was Tuesday. I had to check. I was like, it's Tuesday. No, yeah, it is. Uh, cool. That sounds lovely. Oh, Ray is here. Ray, I received your packages. They're in the kitchen. I have to notify Jasmine and Dad after this is over to let them know that I have them. I got back just in time, which is also why I'm not in cosplay, because I had to run errands today and go to the post office, and I went to the liquor barn, and I had to, I don't know where Swiftblood is, if Swiftblood is here. I'm gonna get into that. I'm gonna wait till Swiftblood gets here. I have to go do night check at work. Someone kidnapped me. Consider Dad notified. Excellent. Yes, I have a package for you in my home. So if you wouldn't mind coming over here and spending time with me in order to receive this package, that would be fantastic. I would be really, you'll only have to put up with me for a few minutes, and then you can skedaddle with your package. I believe it's the one with the black on it. I will definitely also new game. Oh, you will definitely also, there's a new game. Got it. Okay. I mushed those things together. So, and then I believe the other one is for Jasmine, so I will have to notify Jasmine after this. I didn't really get a whole lot of time. I was busy trying to make coffee liqueur out of the... Plus, very so curious about the game Dad found. Me too, and I almost regret my choice. And I'll tell you why. Because, as you know, when Dad called me and gave me the question of where would I rather, he didn't even give me any other information and just listed theater or carnival, I believe, were the choices. And I freaked out thinking he meant to then take me to one of those places. And I wasn't really thinking clearly, and I didn't really, I don't think I picked well, because tonight's theme is murder mystery in a theater. So, unfortunately, no. I would prefer actually carnival than theater. Like I said, I don't want to hang out in a theater. Luckily, there aren't a lot of actors in this chapter, so feel better about that. Yes, I do like hazelnut, and also, I specifically went to Liquor Barn to get two things. Oh, that was a notification. Sorry. I went to get raspberry syrup so I could make like the best cold foam. I think I can give that cranberry creme brulee was the other Bones coffee that you sent. And I was like, this needs this. This needs this. So I had to go out specifically to get the most out of it. I want to try it. I feel like it'll be good. I don't know. We'll see. I could ruin it. It could end up being either too sweet or the fruit doesn't mesh. Anyway, you're fine. Don't worry about it. At least one of us is making videos. So no, I'm upset about the Sumatra. And by upset, I mean I'm just going to do something else with it. So I'm making coffee liqueur with Sumatra in my kitchen. Which is another reason why I had to go to Liquor Barn. I had to get some good vodka to make coffee liqueur. So TikTok didn't hear any of that, by the way. They better not. They better not. I'm only talking about it. I'm not doing anything on camera. But that is something that I'm currently working on. Yeah, so I was like, hey Dave, if you see a pile of coffee grounds in the kitchen, don't worry about it. Also, don't throw those out. And he was like, okay. We'll see how it goes. Hi. Good to see you. Good to see people are getting in here. I don't know what I'm going to do about this lid. I can't keep fiddling with this lid the entire time. Okay. Lid the entire time. Okay. What did I make today? This is the circus. Sorry, that doesn't make sense to anybody but me. Took me a second. I was like, what coffee did I make before the live today? I don't remember. It was Big Bang. This is the mug that Maybe gave me. I cried when I got it, so like I didn't put it up. But this was from Maybe, and it has little kitty. It's so cute. It's so cute. And it came with like a little mug warmer. That's what made me freak out. I started crying. There's like a little plate over here. It's like a little hot plate. You just set your cup on top of it, and it keeps your tea or your coffee warm. It's the most adorable thing ever, and I love it. And also is just pressurized. So you could technically put any cat mug on there. And I do, habitually. Every single cat mug goes on that hot plate. It hangs out in here with the cat. Do I own any Baccano manga? Oh, I do not. I remember getting that in the Discord the other day, and I was at work, and then I was like, I need to use my GPS. I can't do this. And then I forgot to answer you. I'm so sorry. No, I do not. I don't have a whole lot of manga or anything like that due to unfortunate events that occurred in my youth. We won't go into it, but needless to say, I don't have a whole lot of manga. And Baccano, and despite being my favorite anime, I do not own any of the manga or light novels, so that's intriguing. I'll have to look those up. Thank you for the likes. So, how are you all? Hopefully mentally stable and healthy. Hopefully you all ate before this event. I believe I must have mentioned last time the next 2 chapters are gonna be kind of stretched chapters, because normally I read about 30 pages max. These chapters are just long enough to the point where I want to get through them all in one go. So they're 40, so it's a little bit longer. If you can give me your attention for just a little bit longer, we'll get through it. But okay, Crimson, you dashed my hopes. I was really hoping you were doing fantastic. Unfortunate. I think the fake blood stained my face. You should wash that off. You shouldn't leave that on there for so long. And it'll go away. If it's stained, it takes about an average of 24 hours. Do you have to work tomorrow? Because that would be really amusing. As if you had to do the work thing and then go in there like that. Although, if you really play it up, you could make it sound like you were in some terrible accident and play for sympathy. And then that way, maybe Karens won't yell at you all morning. I would go that route, personally. One time I had to wear a boot for several months, and when I came back, I wore the boot one extra day so that I could get more money. because I don't get paid enough. Good. Glad to hear it's getting better. I hope you took something before this. But even so, even if you get tired and fall asleep, at least hopefully your headache goes away. That is a viable strategy. I don't. Your fingers are asleep? I'm not sure what that means. Did you do something? What happened? Hello, good to see you. What is happening? Something. What is happening in my comment section right now? Why are you all laughing? Is it me? Because of the boot thing? That's a viable strategy. I'll hear no words against it. It works. Especially if you're in a job where you're tip dependent. So, I don't want to hear it. Oh, is that what that means? Okay. I think it's the best strategy. This is really just a how-to guide for Crimson. I should just collate everything I've ever done and hand it to Crimson. I don't know, man. I rather like it. Maybe that's just me, but I'm not much of a daylight person. It blinds me. But maybe that's because my schedule is primarily at night. Taking mental notes all the time. I'll send you a laminated copy of like a poster that you can put in your rear view mirror so you have it for reference. Dark at 5 is the best time. Makes me feel better. I feel more functional in the dark. Anytime the sun is out, I just get really tired. I don't know. I feel so, and my brain doesn't work as well. I can't create coherent sentences and structure them in a manner that makes sense to anybody but me. So it just comes out as nonsense words that you've just got to conjoin together for yourself. And I can't be bothered. I don't really wake up until the sun sets, and then I'm like, all right, I'm ready to go. It's unfortunate. Oh, good. Tipsu card reader. Yes. We can tip on like the app now. So we can also see if you've tipped through the app now. So it's really funny when you go up and you're like, did you want to leave a tip? And they're like, oh, I did. And I'm like, no, you didn't. And they're like, what? I'm like, it says 0. And they're like, oh, and no one wants to look like a jerk. So then they try and lie. And that's even funnier. I had one woman, I just told her to stop the other day. It was probably a bad move, but I don't care enough. I was like, did you want to leave a tip? And she was like, oh, I already did. And I was like, did you? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, oh, crazy, because it says 0. And she was like, oh, I mean, like, I tipped on the other card. And I was like, oh, well, if it's a split payment, it shows both cards on there, so we would know. And she was like, well, what I meant is I ordered earlier, but it got canceled. And I was like, oh, well, then the money should have been refunded. That doesn't count as a tip, but you can retip on the amount that was refunded. So if you want to go ahead and tip out of that, you can. And then she just paused for a second and she was like, well, my money didn't come back to my card yet. And I was like, just say no. And she was like, I'm sorry. And I was like, don't lie to me. You could just say no and I'd respect you more. And she was like, I'm going to call your manager. And I was like, okay, well, you do that because I'm standing out in 30 degrees in the rain. And instead of just owning up to it, you're lying to me. And then I just went back to my car and I was like, man, I'm going to get a call on that one. Don't try and play mind games with me, though. I'll win. Like, don't lie to me. I can see it. I know, I was like, don't lie to me, though. Do not lie to me. That is my number one pet peeve, is you could just say no, and I'll still be cool with it. I might think you're a jerk, because you are. But at least you were an honest jerk. At least you put all your cards on the table. You know what I mean? You don't try and work this duplicity scandal. Fuck you. Much less the more you lie to me and the more you respond, the more I'm just standing on your doorstep and pouring down rain in 30-degree weather. You could have just said no, my guy. You're still a jerk, but at least you're an honest jerk. And at least it doesn't keep me out in the rain continuously for several minutes. Way to go. Way to go. You killed it. Yeah, I like it to an extent because for a large majority of the night, I get to ride around in my car and not talk to anyone and listen to a podcast or listen to weird music. You all know what I listen to. And just roll through my nights like that. And it's interspersed with small intervals of interacting with people. And most of those interactions are very quick and effortless and don't take a lot out of me. But when you try and lie or when you get aggressive for no reason, come on, it's food. It's not that deep. It's not that deep. Y'all are really gunning for this too much. Too hard. Ohio's got so much. Their streets are shit. I've driven around various parts of Ohio, and I don't know if I've just been to all the bad places. But I swear, every single road in Ohio is like almost legally required to have like 5 potholes. And I'm not sure why that is. It's like some sort of city mandate. So at least I can say for Kentucky it's safer. It's safer, at least marginally. Granted, depending on where you're driving in Kentucky, it can be terrible. But on the whole, the roads are at least better. Not as bad as Ohio's. They are, but not as bad as Ohio's. Our roads are falling apart, and there's almost constant construction every single time I go anywhere in Kentucky. But at least it doesn't have at least 5 mandated potholes that are larger than a foot deep. Because I have taken out tires in Ohio just from not being able to avoid them on the interstate. On the interstate. Not even like on the interstate. They be having potholes that exceed 6 inches in depth. At the very least. Because I've taken out a whole tire. Kentucky, I haven't had that problem. Kentucky, I've never had that problem. Granted, you'll startle yourself in Kentucky. You'll be going and you'll hit a minor pothole and you're like, oh shit. And then you check and you haven't lost air pressure, so you're fine. You don't hear any weird noises. Your car isn't wibbly wobbly. You're fine. But Ohio, you take out a whole tire that way. It is. It's like a roller coaster. Exactly. It's like city mandate or something that you have to have at least on any major road. You have to have at least mandated 5 potholes. I'm done. I'm done calling out traffic problems. I could go on about this all day. I have traffic problems at the yin yang, but we gotta get started. I wanted to show you guys something really quick because y'all have been really on the stuffy train, and I love all the cats. I love all the cats that you sent me. But now the cats have a buddy. Dave got the cats a buddy, and now it just very much reads the kid from fucking the Cats of Ulthar. And now we have a guardian for the cats, and don't worry, he's not gonna let anything happen to him. It's Darby Allin. I now have, if you don't know, I watch pro wrestling because I'm lame, and I'm a huge Darby Allin fan, and I got a Darby Allin, and he guards the cats now. He's in charge of all the cats. It's adorable, and I really like the dynamic we got going on now, because now it's just Darby laying on a bunch of cats, and it's my new favorite thing, and I can't get over it. He did have a voice box that anytime you hit him, he would like make wrestling sounds, but it got really annoying really quickly, and I was like, I have to turn this off. This is too loud and too grating. Thank you. That's too many compliments in one sentence, and it makes my chest hurt a little bit. Don't... It's fine. Thank you for the compliments. I appreciate that. Put a pic in the recorder. I'll put a pic in the Discord. That was like word soup. The redacted, there we go. I was like, the what? I was not a word. Got it. I'll put a pic in there later. This is really adorable. It's directly off screen. Okay. But we gotta get started because we got a lot of stuff to go through. So if you are new here and you don't know what we do, this isn't where I just bullshit for several hours. Although I'm sure there's somebody who would be into that, it's not us. And actually, this is a book club where we read a book every single week. And we've been reading an entire series from the get. It's like over a year. And it's 5 books in total for this series. We are on the very last one. So if you don't know what happens, and you've never been in this live, and you're not going to know what's going on, you can alternatively go to the YouTube and catch up. Now, I do need to update the YouTube, and I'm still working on that. I swear I am. I promise. I've just been kind of bummed lately, and I'm getting it together. So just give me some time. But I have finished the project I was paid to do that I really didn't want to do, and I'm just emotionally recovering, so it's fine. But we're on the 5th book of the Johannes Cabal series by Jonathan Howard. This one is The Fall of House Cabal, and to anybody who doesn't know, it's structured rather odd. I believe I've told everyone who's normally here, but the chapters are all very long. There's only about 6 chapters in the entire book, and we can't be reading those the entire time, but I believe we can get through all of the second way today. It's only 40 pages as opposed to like 100. And I think I can get through it if you all can. So this one, we're going to go through Leonie Barrow's way. The Demon Book. Alright, so are we ready to go? I'll give you all a recap, but it wouldn't really do much good for this. But we have followed along with Johannes and Zarenya and somehow Elizabeth if you remember who Elizabeth was. She was the Witch Queen of the Jade Pagoda in the Dreamlands in Book 3, and she's returned somehow, even though she's technically dead and a resident of the Dreamlands. They don't really know how that happened, other than the place that they are doesn't even necessarily exist, so it doesn't preclude her from her having the ability to exist. And they all went their separate ways and encountered Nemesis, the actual spirit of Nemesis. And that has nothing to do with this chapter, so. But just in case you wanted to know. The second way, Leonie Barrow, the Great Detective. I also feel exceptionally that Ray will really enjoy this chapter. One moment, they were at the prophesied place on the outskirts of Constantinople. The next, they most certainly weren't. "So," said Horst, taking in their abruptly altered surroundings, "this is the fabled kingdom of Prester John, is it? It's a bit more industrial than I'd imagined. Is it usual to have a deep-cast mine in the middle of a city?" They were in an unprepossessing urban street, illuminated by gaslights running down either side, one side faced with a long row of small terraced houses on the two-up, two-down variety, net curtains hanging like cataracts in the blank, dark eyes of their windows. The red brickwork barely showed through the grime of 10,000 chimneys, yet the glass of the windows was clean, the paintwork maintained, and the doorsteps assiduously scrubbed. The phrase "poor but proud" could not help but occur to the disinterested viewer. The opposite side of the street was marked by a brick wall, some 10 feet in height, and looming beyond it were the lift works of 2 deep-cast mine shafts, the distinctive asymmetric triangle of the structures and the great wheels of the cable runners, some 50 feet from the ground, more suited to a Welsh valley or a northern hillside. Behind the buildings was the lowering bulk of a spoil heap, the leavings of the coal extraction process. "I'll be blunt," continued Horst. "It's less mystical than I hoped. There, I said it. You had your mysticism in Fable Kingdom just before we got here." Miss Barrow was far less judgmental about their new surroundings, and far more intrigued. "All that business with the bored man on the throne with the tusks, you recall? No, that was just an overture. This is the real point of our journey." "If you say so." Horst stuck his hands in his pockets. "Don't really see what the idea of the magical shenanigans dumping us by a town center coal mining operation is, though." "I think that may be the point." "The point?" "The point is, we have to find the point." Horst sighed, and his breath coalesced in the chill air of the night. "I was rather hoping for something a bit more adventuresome. Bandits, pirates," he thought on for a moment. "Giant ants," he concluded. "Adventures are where you find them. Ah, we have company." Horst followed her line of sight and saw a police constable of serious demeanor strolling slowly towards them with the steady pace of justice unavoidable. He was wondering how they would explain away their light summer clothes chosen for the Turkish climate when he abruptly realized Miss Barrow was wearing heavy autumnal clothes, and with a shock that so was he. Miss Barrow examined her gloved hand with only moderate surprise before glancing back at him to check that, yes, he too had noticed the change in circumstances. "Evening, ma'am," said the constable as he reached them. "Sir?" He touched the brim of his helmet, but that was the limit of his courtesy as he regarded them with undiluted suspicion. "Good evening, constable," said Miss Barrow. "A chill one, at that." "It is that. Got lost, have you?" This to Horst. "Long way from the south side here." "I suppose we must have. Well, you know how it is. You get talking, and the next thing you know, you've wandered miles." Horst said it with the easy duplicity of a man whose success with women was equaled by his competence at not having 7 shades beaten out of him by their attending fathers, brothers, and occasionally husbands. "Just so, sir." The constable had apparently been lied to by better than Horst, which was injurious to the pride of them both. He glanced sideways at Miss Barrow, and remarkably, his brow raised with apparent recognition. Might I inquire your name, ma'am?" Less inured to casual duplicity than Horst, Miss Leonie Barrow blithely supplied it. The result was magical. "Miss Barrow," said he, worthy in surge, "I thought I knew you." He glanced around the dark houses and nodded. "Of course, you'll be on the job, won't you?" Leonie was at quite the loss. Horst glowered on her behalf. "What are you implying?" His chivalric wrath was both unnecessary and unnoticed, for the policeman said, "On a case, of course." "A case?" Leonie Barrow considered the words, and the sense of rightness they carried clustered about her on the instant like a cloud of supportive butterflies. "A case?" She looked at the constable, and the look of respect she found there. Not simply the respect any police officer should show an innocent member of the public, but rather a professional respect, an earned respect. A case! On what felt momentarily like impulse, but which she realized, even during its commission, was a grounded and logical suspicion, she opened the reticule that hung upon her arm and looked within. There she found a small but very practical semi-automatic pistol and a business card case. This she opened, took a moment to enjoy the thrill of what she was already sure she would find there, then withdrew a card and handed it to the constable. Horst, all confusion and frowns, and the more adorable for them, shuffled quietly around that he might read the card over the officer's shoulder. Miss Leonie Barrow, M.Phil. Oxon Cantab, Forensic and Security Consultant. Private Detective. "Yes," she said, her smile confident and open. "Yes, we are on a case." It transpired that they were soon to be on another. The constable informed them that Inspector Lamont of the yard required her presence at the earliest convenience. If she could get in touch as soon as possible, he might have need of her proven powers of deduction. She could also bring along her assistant, Horst Cabal, if she must. To this end, the constable accompanied them to the nearest police telephone box to call in. "Assistant!" Horst was filled with as much outrage as he could manage without making a scene, expressed as a high-pitched whisper. "How have events conspired to make me your assistant?" "You have a problem, being subordinate to a woman," said Leonie. "Not if they're clever, and Johannes seems to think that you are." That brought Leonie to a dead halt. "He said that?" Horst thought about it to make sure he was definitely talking about the same woman. "Yes, I'm sure he meant you." He waved her on to keep up with the policeman. Once they were underway once more, he continued, "But that's not what I mean. The way he said assistant, there was a distinct subtext of comedy sidekick about it, and I'm not sure I care for that." "I'm sure you imagined it," Leonie reassured him, while equally sure that he had not. Then she cut off any further utterances of hurt on his part by saying, "A detective, though. Isn't it wonderful? Just like Sherlock Holmes." "Prettier than Sherlock Holmes," said Horst, the reflexive gallant. "The trouble is, I think they're expecting you to do some detecting." She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. "And?" And you're not. A detective, that is. What are we going to do when they present you with some terrifically complicated case and there isn't a handy butler to point at? And what do you think I'm going to do? How should I know? I'm not a detective. No, you're not. Wait. Horst's tone was warning. Wait a minute. You cannot seriously be suggesting we are going to look at the case and then I'm going to solve it. Don't you understand, Horst? That's what this place is. It's a test. It's cobbled something together from the real world that touches on what we do, and now we're going to be tested upon how well we do it. Have you ever actually done any real detective work before? A little. With your brother along, but a little. And I've done a great deal of studying. Have a little faith in me, would you? Horst grimaced. And what's my role in all this? You're my faithful assistant. Apparently. This failed to pour any oil on troubled waters. Leonie wondered if said oil was perhaps flammable. It was worth the experiment, so she carelessly and with malice aforethought added, and the comedy sidekick. Horst began to express outrage at such presumption, but then saw Miss Barrow's smile, and his wrath was punctured. He smiled back, albeit a little dejectedly. What if we can't crack the case? She had not considered that, but at the instant she did, the ramifications became apparent. Somewhere at the end of this was something wonderful, too wonderful to simply be given away or to allow second attempts. We'll probably be kicked out of here and never permitted to return. Oh, dear, that'll be tough to explain to Johannes. He'll have to have a shot if we mess it up. I don't think he'll have that option, to be honest. She looked around at the city about them. This quest of his isn't simply about collecting the clues. I'm beginning to see that now. It isn't? I was guaranteed a simple few weeks of clue gathering, dumping them in triumph at Johannes's feet, and then wandering off while he makes sense of them. What makes you think it's not going to work that way? Because this is where I want to be, Horst. Doing what my dad did, if not quite by the same methods, solving crimes, setting things right, making things better. This is tailor-made for me. I don't think this place even existed until I agreed to help your brother. The dice are already cast. There's no going back now. I'm the great detective. You're the light relief, and there's a crime to solve. They reached the police telephone box a few paces behind the constable, who had already unlocked a small door in the large blue box's side to reach the phone that lay there. We have to keep the handset locked away in this neighborhood, elsewise the kids will cut the wire. Little buggers. He blushed. Begging your pardon, ma'am. To cover his confusion over such saucy language, he made a great show of calling the police switchboard and thence being redirected to the office of lament of the yard. I have Miss Leonie Barrow for you, sir, he said, with the air of a herald announcing the arrival of an empress before passing the handset to Leonie. From Horst's perspective, the telephone conversation was brief and willfully enigmatic. Miss Barrow performed a few various serious nods and said, I see, Inspector, twice, and yes, 4 times, and made some small notes in a small black book that she produced from her pocket, as if she knew exactly how this platonic ideal of her carried such things. Then, infuriatingly, she said, Interesting, in such a way to indicate that it really was terribly interesting, and curiosity fairly made Horst squirm. Then she concluded the call with brusque efficiency and demanded of the constable, Where might we find a cab in this area at this hour? The constable indulged in a chortle. Nowhere, ma'am. Nobody around here can afford a taxi, but the station's not far from here, and we can send you over to where the inspector needs you in the area car. Where would that be, ma'am? The Alhambra Theatre was a grand venue. Of that there was no doubt. A large structure in a far more prosperous section of the city than the terraces by the mines. The theatre faced onto a grand thoroughfare of Roman pretension. The theatre itself would not have disgraced imperial Rome, a vast portico of pale stone in the neoclassical style of a scale to make the Glyptotek of Munich seem like a pup tent, topped by a frieze in which Shakespearean characters rub shoulders with Euterpe, Calliope, tragic Melpomene, and the comedic Thalia. "That," said Horst, as they stepped from the police car, "is quite a large theatre." He smiled at Leonie. "That was an understatement. I've been practicing it. Actually, that theater is absolutely huge. I've never seen the like. You could put the Bible on in here and have all the characters on stage for the encore, including the 5,000 with their fish sandwiches." "I'm not sure that the Bible specifically mentions fish sandwiches." Miss Barrow walked by him and started up the steps. "It hardly needs to, does it? What else are you going to do with fish and bread?" He followed her, considering such exciting theological concepts as he went, and finding solace thereby. After all, how could such a philosophical cove as he be regarded as a humorous sidekick? At the entrance they were met by a police sergeant, who took charge of them and conveyed them thence to the presence of Inspector Lamont. Their route took them through the theatre's foyer, a fantasy wrought in marble and red carpet and sweeping staircases that would have given the impression of an opulent ballroom, but for the footling detail that no ballroom was as large, nor did any ballroom of such grandeur usually aspire to selling ice cream in little tubs and cartons of cold drink most safely described as orangesque. They processed through the doors marked as the provenance of staff only, and subsequent to some windings about narrow corridors whose layout seemed to have been settled upon using oh my god, I always fuck up this word. Haruspicae. There we go. I always have to think of augers before saying haruspicae, or else I'll say spicy. Subsequent to some windings about narrow corridors whose layouts seemed to have been settled upon using haruspicae, finally, and a little unexpectedly, found themselves in the wings and so onto the stage. "Always wanted to be on the stage," said Horst. He looked about him. The place was peppered about with strange items of apparatus and faux oriental decorations, hangings, and lanterns. He was just wondering what sort of play would have such a curious setting when he belatedly realized that a dummy of a man in brightly colored silken robes, sitting slumped in some form of throne, was in fact not a dummy at all. "Oh, look!" he said, as if spotting an uncommon yet not rare bird during a stroll. "There's a dead feller." This struck him as odd in two respects. Firstly, that even quite outre productions rarely have corpses on stage. This, he reasoned brilliantly, must be the victim of the perfidious crime that he and Leonie Barrow had been summoned to solve. After a moment, he revised the thought. This must be the perfidious crime that Leonie Barrow and he had been summoned to solve. The second odd detail was not one he thought wise to mention in open company. The man seemed to have suffered a chest wound of some description, to judge from the large red stain that disfigured the gorgeous robes. There was a good deal of blood there, and yet Horst, a vampire, had failed to scent it. Usually the smell of blood glowed in his senses, much as the scent of bacon does for so many others. On this occasion, though, he was barely aware of it. Did this mean the blood was fake, or... He belatedly noticed that he was breathing, and it wasn't purely for purposes of conversation. He tried holding his breath, and it quickly became uncomfortable, so he started breathing again. He thought of blood, and it seemed unappealing. Leonie noticed his very apparent consternation. "What is it?" she asked him quietly. "Whatever is the matter?" Mr. Cabal? I... He looked at her aghast as he understood the desire that was growing in him. Miss Barrow, the most extraordinary... I... He looked at her wide-eyed. I could absolutely kill a bacon sandwich. There's a cabbie's calf around the corner, son, said the sergeant. Go off and get yourself stoked. This looks to be an all-nighter. With a muttered apology to Miss Barrow and a promise to be back ever so quickly, Horst bolted back for the wings. She regarded him thoughtfully as he disappeared back into the staff-only corridors, a lust for bacon roll lending him unerring navigational skills through the labyrinth. Loves his bacon, doesn't he, miss? Said the sergeant. Only very recently, she said slowly. Usually his tastes are distinctly more rarefied. She turned her attention to the dead man on the gaudy throne. In his absence, perhaps you might tell me why I'm here. Oh? The inspector cleared his throat with the sardonic air of a man who is used to being outshone by gifted amateurs. You can't tell. She favored him with a cool glance, then said, Well, all I see is the obvious, a dead man chained upon a throne. He appears to have been shot in the chest by a coral, presumably launched from the crossbow mounted over there. Its trigger pulled by the sand-driven timing mechanism standing by it. Without knowing the specifics of the event, one guesses he is a stage magician whose grand escape from the throne of death, or whatever else the publicist might call it, proved rather tardy. Presumably, in the normal run of things, he would free himself at the last second, flinging himself aside as the fatal bolt is shot. She crouched by the throne, looking at the coral shaft still protruding from the dead man's chest. There was a great deal of blood, considering it was not an open wound. The pressure required to force blood by the shaft offered confirmation to her opinion that the coral head must have penetrated the left side of the heart, causing rapid shock and insanguination. No doctor could have saved him, she said, half to herself. She straightened and addressed Inspector Lamont. So, what makes you think it wasn't simply an accident, Inspector? Conjurers and escapologists have died when things haven't gone as planned before. Lamont was examining the crossbow, hands clasped behind his back, to prevent him inadvertently touching anything. True, Miss Barrow, but our man Maleficaris here seemed to think this would be his last performance. He did. Leonie was just concentrating on pursing her lips and nodding in the most ineffably wise manner she could manage, when her equanimity abruptly shattered. Hold on! What was his name? The inspector made a show of consulting his notebook. Maximilian Maleficaris, a.k.a. Maleficaris the Magnificent. Rather an impressive show from what I've heard, miss. Leastways, he nodded at the corpse. I doubt anyone will be forgetting this performance in a hurry. And that's intermission. Yeah. So if you were wondering, what happened to Maleficaris Sr.? We'll be back after these brief commercial breaks. You don't want to talk about it? You have no questions? Keep in mind, this is Maleficaris Sr. Yeah. I thought you'd enjoy this. I really thought Ray would dig it because it's very Sherlock Holmes-esque. They even throw a couple of Sherlock references in there. It's the case of the death of Maleficaris the Magnificent Sr. That's what she's solving. They made it through the gate that Johannes sent them to in Constantinople. and mysteriously found them in the city of Sepulture, is what it's called. You find out later. It's not really a big giveaway. And they need to solve a murder. And Leonie Barrow is a great detective. And the murder is of Maleficaris the Magnificent Sr. Hi, Toby. Toby says hi. So yes, it's a murder mystery at the theater. Fortunately, there's only one real actor, so otherwise I would absolutely refuse to read it. No, I wouldn't. I would still read it. It would be terrible, but I would read it. I am having the best day of my week right now, so this is the best day of my week, honestly. The most fun. And I hope you all are also having a good time, so I thought you might enjoy this one. Leonie and Horst interacting with no chaperone sort of deal, because normally there's like Johannes as a buffer, but it's just Leonie and Horst getting to know each other, getting on each other's nerves. Horst is for some reason just plain old human, really into bacon at the moment. That's why I was telling Nodi we'll have to get Horst a bacon roll for some of the shots that I want to take. I was like, how do you feel about eating a bacon sandwich? And Nodi was like, okay. Horst is best boy. Now, because this is a murder mystery, I kind of want to... I do kind of want... I wish I could break it up into two, almost, because I want to hear Ray's thoughts specifically on this chapter. So Ray specifically has homework. No one else does, but Ray does. Only interested in what Ray has to say. No, I'm joking. If you all, likewise, want to do homework, that's completely voluntary, but for Ray, it's involuntary, and you do have to turn it in. It is worth 10% of your grade. I'm not taking any notes or any other suggestions. Yeah, you have to do it. I thought maybe, is this unfair? And then I was like, no, it's not. It's not. It's catered to you, really, more than anything. You should take it as a compliment. Damn. I just went whole Aizawa there for a second. I'm like, you do have to do it. You really should take it as a compliment. I'm like, how did I do it that way? Yes, you're now responsible for everyone's 10% of their grade, and you do have to turn it in. There are 5 in the series. We are on the 5th one. They are all by Jonathan Howard. The first one is called Johannes Cabal the Necromancer, if you want to look it up. And from therein, you can find the entire series. There are a large amount of short stories that you can also read. They are all on my YouTube, all the way up until the tail end of the 4th book, which I have to re-record some footage for. And I'm getting that caught up as soon as I can. But they are all separated by book, and the chapters should be in order on my YouTube. You can also go purchase the books from Jonathan Howard. I'm sure he'd appreciate the revenue, as he is indicated in multiple author forwards. So, just to make sure he doesn't poison us all, I recommend we all buy a copy. No. Yes, I did, and that is going to be the Christmas special. We're going to be moving on to a new series. We've already kind of settled on This series is going to be the Miss Peregrine's Peculiar Children series. I'm pretty sure. I've vetted the first one. It looks good. It looks relatively appropriate. I just don't want any like super graphic scenes or in any of the books. But primarily, horror is appropriate to a determinate level. I doubt I could get through like The Troop or something, but general creepiness, young adult novels, as long as they're not super graphic in any respect, I will take suggestions. So if you have any suggestions or recommendations, you can always drop them in the Discord. But I do believe the very next one, is going to be Miss Peregrine's. But that will be the next series that we do. But I just enjoy reading, and people like listening to me read stuff. And maybe it'll be better if you listen to it. I don't know. Definitely. And if it makes it better to have someone read it to you, I'll certainly do that. People seem to enjoy me reading. I really like reading. So I'm pretty excited about it. I blasted through the first one. I really enjoyed it. I'm on the second one now. But I think normally the first book in a series is good for a vetting process. It sort of sets the tone. And I like the tone. So we're going to do that. We had reports? You've had book reports, dude, this entire time, Lady Eva. I cannot believe. No, it's okay. They're entirely voluntary. I just really like hearing what you all think about, what's going to happen, the subject matter, who you think is behind the entire thing. I like those kind of things. And listening to your all's mental process through the journey. It's fun for me. You'll have to curve it if I'm... Yeah, no, don't worry. You don't have to turn those in. Ray does, though. Ray specifically has to. Nobody ever gave me a eulogy. I'm so upset about that. That's the one thing I really wanted. Nobody did it. So upset. Because more than half the time the comments in the back were just like, what's a eulogy? And I was like, God damn it. It's all right. I just like hearing what you guys think about the series, or where you think the series is going, or what you think about certain characters and how they're represented and different things, in a more direct and natural way. Because just comments scrolling through, sometimes you miss out on stuff. Sometimes you're in the middle of talking and you miss stuff, and you don't get the full effect of like the entirety of any one given person's personality or thought process on the entire time. You just sort of got to piece it together over time, if you can even do that. Because sometimes, through more than half this live I'm reading, so I don't get to read everything that you all say. I miss things. I have one, I just can't find it. Wait, you wrote a eulogy for Puddin'? Is that what you're saying to me? That sounds sad. You wrote a eulogy for a cat? I did write my own eulogy at one point when I was growing up, just for funsies. I wasn't even required to do it. I just wanted to. And then my mom found it later and I thought it was on a live note, and I was like, no, that's not what that was. It was really funny though, because I was just a TA, and I thought it was a really interesting assignment. I was like, yo, can I do it too? And he was like, yeah, sure. And he was like, I'm not going to grade you. And I was like, that's fine. And so I just kept it, and then later it caused problems. It was really funny. Oh no. Oh no. Aw. I don't know if I can make it through a cat eulogy, to be real with you. If I cry, you get bonus points. Because it's really hard to make me cry, actually. It's really easy for me to make myself cry, but it doesn't always succeed in any other respect. I gotta read this cat eulogy. Now we're bringing the mood down. We can't be doing that. All right. I do want to read your cat eulogy, though. If you find the cat eulogy, please send it to me. Do it. Yes. Don't tell me you're sending me a eulogy either. Just send it to me and let me figure it out. Thank you for the likes. Oh, we're gonna get going now. Does anybody want to finish the second half of this? Second half is a little bit longer than the first, but I wanted to have a break right before all the detective work we gotta get into. 2. All right. Let's get into it. I'm beginning to see what you mean about how this place reflects the people who find it, said Horst. He was eating the 4th of 6 bacon rolls he had been carrying on his return, the first of which he devoured en route. Maleficaris? It's an unusual enough name, after all. There can't be that many of them about. Even fewer after Johannes crossed paths with them. He mentioned running into Maleficaris Sr. once upon a time, but I don't think it played out like this. Much too mundane for my darling brother. From what I gather, it was all rather more occult. He illustrated this understanding of occult by waggling his fingers, immediately employing them on the conclusion of his illustration by re-engaging the diminishing stack of bacon rolls. I know about the son, Rufus Maleficaris, or at least a little about him. A necromancer too, wasn't he? Said Horace. But he's dead now, twice. Well, not quite dead, sort of dead. You know how it is with necromancers. Leonie Barrow decided not to pursue the subject, what was just as well given the sordid and bloody details of Rufus Maleficaris' varied career as necromancer, Lord of Powers, freestyle bastard, and talking box. They were talking quietly in a corner of the backstage while waiting for the theater manager, Mr. Curry, to conclude his statement to the police. Leonie had already told Horst what had happened on stage that evening, as witnessed by a full house. The performance had gone through assorted pieces of legerdemain and illusion, and been as well received as every previous performance. Maleficaris the Magnificent was a highly regarded and very popular magician, routinely performing before the crowned heads of Europe, the oligarchs of America, and the general unwashed of everywhere. So he had arrived at a literal showstopper, the last wonder to be performed before the interval, and just for once, the show had stopped him. The effect was entitled The Throne of Death, exactly as Miss Barrow had predicted with an accuracy that now perturbed her. It was a little bit of mild Grand Guignol, suitable for family audiences, Petit Guignol, if you will. Max Maleficaris began by relating a tale to the audience of a mandarin of the mysterious and exotic Orient. A terrible man of profane appetites, he preyed on those he should have governed and thereby made them fear him. The tortures he visited upon them were many and imaginative, and the people were cowed. That all came to an end the day a humble traveling scholar happened into the mandarin's power. Here, Maleficaris was garbed in gorgeous and colorful silks, hardly the clothes of a humble traveling scholar, but in a story littered with factual inaccuracies it hardly mattered. And the stage around him was decked out in oriental finery. Lanterns and vases were carried in, the banners sporting fanciful characters that would baffle anyone with even the faintest grounding in cynograms, fluttered down from the fully fly space behind the proscenium. Throughout the transformation, Maleficaris continued the story and detailed how the scholar came to loggerheads with the evil Mandarin and so was condemned to suffer upon the dreadful throne of death. Here Maleficaris was accosted by stagehands laboring under hastily applied yellow face makeup and unconvincing wigs bearing black yarn queues. Struggling, but not too much, he was dragged to the throne and secured upon it, the chains that bound him locked tight with the padlock supplied from a respected member of the audience earlier in the performance and held by them until that moment. A paper screen bearing a fantastical painting of a Chinese dragon was raised before the throne, hiding the victim from the audience's view. Now the Mandarin began the mechanism of murder. Sand ran from a reservoir onto a balance pan, the spring-loaded mechanism that would trigger the crossbow beneath. When the pan was heavy enough to go past the balance point, it would slam down, and the crossbow would launch its deadly cargo directly at Maleficaris' heart. Yet, of course, he was never there when it struck. After struggling valiantly against the chain for the minute or so that the balance required to pass equilibrium, Maleficaris would release himself just as the balance pan started its descent, leaping aside as the bolt flew. Except this time, he had cried out when the mechanism passed the tipping point, a cry he had never made on any of the previous performances, and he remained there, helpless. As the pan struck down, the mechanism was triggered, the crossbow released, the coral flew, his heart was pierced, and as his blood left him. "Sounds like an accident to me," said Horst, and he did so through Bacon. On realizing the faux pas, he swallowed and apologized. "Bacon's the most wonderful thing in the world right now. I don't think coming here just changed our clothes and careers, Miss Barrow. The little voice has gone. Gone altogether." "Little voice? In my head, I have a little voice." Leonie laughed. "Your conscience?" "No," Horst was emphatic. "I don't need a little voice to tell me not to do bad things. The little voice I mean is the one that specifically tells me to do bad things." "You have an anti-conscience?" Yes. It came with being a vampire. Stick your fangs in that one. Break that one's neck. All the time. Such a nag. Anyway, it's shut up. I don't even think I can do the thing with my fangs. Extend them. Can't seem to do that at all. Blood suddenly seems like a pretty unpleasant thing to be feeding on, and I suddenly have an urge for bacon. "You're not a vampire," Leonie said with barely a thought. It was so obvious a conclusion. "Not anymore." "Exactly. This place, wherever we are, has de-vampired me. Somehow." She considered this. "I wonder why." "I'm more wondering if it's permanent." His tone made her look him in the face. There was a longing there, and she understood just how desperately he wanted it to be true. He stirred the nest of paper bags on the small table where they sat, looking for any surviving bacon rolls. "What if it's permanent?" Mr. Curry was pink and round, startled and baffled, tired and dismayed. "I really cannot see what I can tell you that I haven't already told the police, madam," he said, and patted his florid face with a handkerchief redolent of lavender. "In all eventuality, Mr. Curry, nothing. But one never knows." She smiled and was charming, and Mr. Curry was charmed and smiled in return. And throughout all this, Miss Barrow wondered when exactly she had become so very charming. "Very well." He became fatuously ebullient as an uncle coaxed into opening the biscuit barrel for the children might. "Very well. Ask your questions, then." Leonie's smile hardened just an iota. "Tell me, Why do you think Mr. Maleficaris was murdered? Curry's smile waned quickly, and he became worried. I don't necessarily think. I've read your statements already, Mr. Curry. You're very cagey about it, and I can understand that. It looks like a tragic accident, and that's probably exactly what it is. Best to get things sorted out and get your theater's name out of the news as quickly as possible. Despite what some think, I doubt many people will come to see a death-defying act in the hope that the performer will die. The thrill of coming close is enough. She spread her hands in a conciliatory manner. I'm simply a consultant the police have on retainer. We all want this dealt with, quickly, for a plethora of reasons. So, in your own time. Curry cast his gaze about his office, seeking alternatives. He sighed upon finding none, and said, He told me, straight to my face. Lemuel, he said, I am not peaceful in my own mind that all will go well this evening. He said that. I asked him what he meant, but he seemed to think he'd already said too much and became as silent as a clam, and then this happens. It was as if... He leaned forwards, opening his eyes too wide for propriety. It was a premonition. It was suicide, said Horst with undue cheerfulness. Bit of a melodramatic way to do it in front of a packed house and all, but all he had to do was twiddle his thumbs and wait for the crossbow to do its business. He noted Leonie Barrow's somewhat acidic expression and changed tack with the natural assurance of the saloon bar Lothario he had once been. Or he was just off his game for some reason. Touch of dyspepsia, not feeling right in himself, frets about things, and when it comes time to do the miraculous escape, he just can't concentrate. Did I pay the news agent for this week? Did I turn the gas off? Did I do this? Did I do that? Oops, out of time. Twang, dead. Horst smiled self-indulgently and awaited the applause for his masterful piece of deduction. When it didn't come, he said, Or it was an accident. It could always have just been one of those things, I suppose. So, to enumerate, Leonie counted off the points on her fingers. It was murder. It was suicide. It was an accident. It was an act of God. She regarded him with dry aspect. These are your conclusions. Yes. His smile wavered as he thought about them. Doesn't actually narrow things down much, does it? Deduction means to take away the things that are not so. Whatever is left is the truth. It's like chipping away from a block of marble until a statue is left. Horst considered this. That's very poetic, Miss Barrow, but for heaven's sake, call me Leonie. Oh, thank you. Yes, where was I? That's very poetic, Leonie, but there are all kinds of statues you might get out of a block of marble. An artist might argue there's only one, and so I stand by the simile. There are all kinds of statues you might make, but only one of them is the truth. All the rest are failures, or, worse yet, miscarriages of justice. We must be careful with our chisels, Horst. Yes, we must. Indeed, we must. He shook his head. I have no idea what you mean by that. For the moment, we have more potential witnesses to interview. Firstly, the closest witness. And who is that? Maleficaris' assistant, one Athena Lamort. Lamort? Horst asked, sensitive to the possibilities of love. Lamort, Leonie corrected him, sensitive to the ubiquity of death. Athena Lamort, born Pansy Kett, was discovered in her changing room, where the police had put her until such a time as they decided what to do next. Horst knocked and entered first, and so discovered Miss Lamort in the process of repairing her makeup. Leonie noted that her eyes were puffy, and when Athena blew into the handkerchief Horst offered her, there was little evidence that the sniffling was histrionic. Even in such a dismayed state, she was clearly a very attractive woman in her mid-20s, dark hair still clipped back as it had been when she had worn it beneath a wig and a headpiece that evening as a concubine of the wicked Mandarin. Beneath her candlewick dressing gown and an unflattering shade of pale terracotta could be seen the historically inaccurate but still very fetching cheongsam she had worn as her costume. "Trick?" she said to Horst inquiry. "There was no trick. That was an honest piece of escapology. Every evening, every matinee, Max had to crack a padlock he hadn't seen before. And he did it. Max is a genius," she faltered. "Was." "Why the paper screen, then?" asked Miss Barrow, sitting by Lamort. Horst had made a beeline to take that chair, but a warning glance from the great detective had stopped him in his tracks, and now he was standing, forced to be sympathetic from a safe distance. Safe for Miss Lamort, that was, since discovering that in this curious city that never was and probably never would be, he was fully human and prey to human wants and desires. Horst recalled which of those wants and desires were his personal favorites, and was looking to exercise them before the presumably inevitable return to vampirism. So far, he had successfully sated his desire for bacon by dint of it being reasonably simple to address. Higher on his list was another desire that Miss Barrow seemed intent on thwarting at every turn. Athena smiled ruefully. "What's honest escapology to a performer isn't really the same to the punters. They think you should be able to pick a lock without tools. Of course, no one can do that, so Max had lockpicks concealed. And the screen was so the audience couldn't see they were hidden in the arms of the throne, or how he used them." She looked hopelessly from face to face. "I can't understand it. The lock was a bog-standard Schumann. Whoever brings in the lock has to give written assurance that the lock is new and hasn't been tampered with in any way. It's closed and unlocked a few times in Max's sight, so he's satisfied nobody's trying to be clever by altering the mechanism. His life depends on it being an honest feat of skill. He could do a Schumann in his sleep. I just don't understand what went wrong. Except," she frowned, "I'm not sure. I'm on stage, obviously. And half of my job is to distract the audience. Nothing is unrehearsed. I always know what I'm supposed to be doing, but maybe my timing was off." Leonie was making notes. "Off in what way?" "I could have sworn the crossbow shot before it was supposed to. Not by much, only a second or two, but that might have been enough." She shook her head. "I'm making something out of nothing. The timing was never quite predictable. You'd think a stand clock would be accurate to a second when it doesn't have to run for very long, wouldn't you?" "Yes," Leonie underlining something. "Yes, I would. Who's responsible for the apparatus? The police mentioned an engineer." "Engineer. Yes, I suppose you could call him that. That's Max's son. I haven't seen him since this all happened." The police seemed to be keen on keeping everyone apart. "That's good practice, Miss Lamort. People's memories are less reliable than you might think. If a couple of witnesses compare notes completely innocently before statements are taken, they can influence one another. Something one of them saw or thought he saw becomes something they both definitely saw." "Yes, I can imagine that." Lamort gestured at her costume. "A lot of a stage illusionist's job is making people think they saw something that they didn't." Leonie wasn't entirely listening. She had noticed Horst's expression had become uncharacteristically serious. "Horst?" "Miss Lamort," he asked, "the son of Mr. Maleficaris, what is his name?" "Rufus," she replied. His name is Rufus Maleficaris. He's the killer, said Horst with certainty as they went to interview the son of the deceased. As sure as night follows day, he's the killer. This isn't our world, Leonie reminded him. He might be a wonderful and loving son here. No, Rufus Maleficaris is a stinker of the first order. His stink is strong enough to travel across the spheres. Even Rufus Maleficaris in every possible world is an utter stinker too. He nodded with a certainty. You'll see. I bet he'll be wearing +4s, the blackguard. He was not wearing +4s. Although that didn't stop Horst from scowling at him. Leonie had never met him in the flesh, and Horst had only seen his corpse, and that is a riffle away from reality. But Horst had heard of the history of Rufus Maleficaris in forensic and unalloyed detail from his brother, and drawn from that the only possible conclusion, Rufus Maleficaris was a stinker. Further, he had seen the result of the Maleficarian magic himself in a conflict that had claimed the lives of people he had liked, and those who had deserved more than to be snuffed out by this, the most preposterous of magicians. Johannes had explained that Maleficaris was not entirely responsible, at least at a metaphysical level, for these specific deaths. Given that he was, however, also undeniably responsible for scores of deaths in a crack-handed scheme that almost resulted in the global extermination of humanity, that footling mitigation was very small beer indeed. This iteration of Rufus Maleficaris wore brown warehouse overalls and suede soft-soled shoes, the better to travel unheard around the near stage areas while a performance was in progress. He was red-haired and clean-shaven, a man barely into his 20s. He was not nearly as ursine as the version Horst was more familiar with, but his frame was large, and it seemed likely he would grow thus in the next few years. He was also surly, which was unendearing. I already spoken to the police, and I didn't see anything, and I wasn't anywhere near the stage when it happened. Why can't I go? You don't seem very heartbroken about your father's death, said Leonie. Leonie gave him... Oh, no, wait, I got that backwards. You don't seem very heartbroken about your father's death, said Horst. Leonie gave him a warning look, but he was at pains to ignore it. In fact, you seem irritated by it. We all die sometime. Magicians get killed doing their acts sometimes. It happens. Not often, but it happens. Bullet catches, water escapes, even a guillotine illusion once, I heard. He smiled, a twisted, cynical line across his face. Audience certainly got their money's worth that night. My dad was very good, but he risked his life every time he sat on that throne. We all knew it. It's the life. He cast his hand around the understage area where he apparently held domain. It seemed to have been at least partially converted into use as a workshop, judging from the workbench, the pots of paint, tools, spools of wire, board, and even welding gear propped up in the corner. What do you think went wrong? Asked Leonie, heading Horst off at the interrogatory pass. Rufus turned his mouth down in a professional consideration, the sort of expression a plumber displays just before he says the dripping tap means a new boiler is required. He was slowing down. It was obvious. Every year it took him longer to do the same old things. He shouldn't have been using such risky prestige at his age. Lost his fire. He was all about going off to the Far East a few years ago, learned some new stuff from them. But that looked too much like work, so he didn't bother. Just carried on with the same old card tricks and nonsense. He'd have been pulling rabbits out of hats at children's parties in a few years the way he was going on. He took a long breath and blew it out. This might be the best thing that ever happened to him. Magicians who get killed by their acts get a sort of immortality. The name of Maleficaris will live on now. Leonie looked up from her notebook. You really don't sound very fond of your father. Fond? Rufus scratched his nose. Not really the kind of man you get fond of. If he'd done what he said he would, gone east, I'd have been proud of him, you know. Do something a bit different. A new direction. But no, that was too much bother. Where exactly were you when the incident occurred? Incident? He laughed without humor. I was checking the props for after the interval, staging them to go into the wings. You were in the wings? No, not at that point. I was under the stage. I spent most of my waking hours under the bloody stage. He half laughed at his choice of words. I'm used to hearing screams from the audience when the crossbow shoots. Then there's laughter and applause. Not tonight, though. Not tonight. I've changed my mind about Rufus Maleficaris, Horst said as they walked back to the stage. He's too obvious. I've read detective stories. I know how this works. This isn't a detective story. Though she was loath to admit it, Leonie couldn't help thinking Rufus was also a little too overtly unlikable to be the villain of the piece. But it is. This isn't real life. You're not really the world's greatest detective, or whatever you're supposed to be, and I'm not the light relief. He pulled a face. Except I am, aren't I? Obsessed with bacon rolls and the fair sex all of a sudden, to comic effect. I thought I was going to have to extract you from Miss Lamort's cleavage with a crowbar. You exaggerate. I made a point of looking at her face once a minute or so. You must admit, though, she's a very handsome creature. If you like that sort of thing, I suppose she is. She chased a half-thought that had occurred to her during the questioning. Doesn't something strike you as a little off about her, though? Off? She seemed very sincere. That's not what I mean. Maximilian's act seems very staid in many respects. Enough to disgust his son, certainly. Yet he is an assistant whose wardrobe seems to run strongly to black, crimson, and silver, who is stage-named for the goddess of wisdom and prudent warfare in addition to death, and whose role on that stage is to play the villainess as much as anything. None of that strikes you as odd. Horst shrugged. You see all sorts of acts, all sorts of themes in the theater. What I mean is how it seems to be two halves of different acts glued together. She simply isn't the sort of assistant I would expect for somebody whose performance is so very much of the old school of gentleman illusionist. She belongs to a more current generation. They arrived at the stage to find Lamont overseeing the work of the police photographer. Overseeing, in this case, comprised mainly of standing to one side and smoking a pipe. Done your detecting then, Miss Barrow? He said, with what Leonie recognized with a small tickle of pleasure was a fond irony. She had only just met Lamont, but in this world their acquaintance was apparently well-formed and mutually respectful. Not nearly, Inspector. The incident has interesting aspects. Lamont's face, already as dour as a bloodhound receiving bad news, fell further. Oh, Lord, it doesn't, does it? I thought we could just chalk this up to a terrible accident and go home. That might yet be the true state of affairs. I'm just curious about some details. Such as? Well, to whom Miss Lamort is betrothed. That would be a beginning. Horst almost jumped. What? What makes you... Leonie touched her bare ring finger. She clearly and habitually wears a ring. The mark on her finger is obvious. Equally obvious, she doesn't wear it for performances. It makes her more interesting and therefore more distracting for male members of the audience if she appears unattached. And a ring is all too apparent when caught in the limelight. I glanced over her dressing table and saw it there, an engagement rather than a wedding ring. I didn't feel it was the right time to inquire directly of her, so I left it until now. Who is her fiancé, Inspector? Lamont didn't even need to resort to his notebook, but simply nodded at the throne. The deceased. Leonie cocked her head. Really? You seem surprised. A little. Presumably, becoming his assistant is how they met in the first place? I would think so, miss. She bit her lip and looked up into the shadows above the stage beyond the grid. One would think so. Indeed, one would. She slapped Horst in the chest with the back of her hand. Come on, faithful sidekick. I need to ask more questions of Miss Lamort. Horst's shoulders sagged at the suggestion. Do you need me to come along? Her changing room's not that close to the stage. She looked him in the eye as she moved a step to present her back to Lamont, and when she was sure she had his undivided attention, said, Cleavage, in an undertone. Lead on, my captain. I shall follow you to the ends of the earth, he said, suddenly motivated. He was to be a little disappointed, however, as by the time they returned, Miss Lamort had changed out of her stage clothes and was wearing an altogether soberer ensemble suitable for returning to her digs. Engaged? Why, yes, to Max. But how is that relevant? Leonie Barrow was candid. I have no idea. I'm simply trying to form a full image of everybody and how they relate to one another. How did you meet Max Maleficaris? Rufus introduced us. His father was encouraging Rufus to spread his wings to go out and put his own act together. Rufus is a very capable magician himself, you know. That was my understanding, said Leonie with a modicum of irony. What happened to those plans? Lamort looked uncomfortable. Max did. I did. We just got on very well, and all of a sudden, Rufus's act didn't seem so pressing. Max needed a new assistant, and it just seemed the obvious thing to do. And how did Rufus take this? He was confused about what was happening at first. Then he was angry. My God, was he angry. But he took a little time off, cooled down, and came back. He said perhaps it was as well he didn't go solo just yet. He wanted to work on his act a little more first, in any case. I see. Purely as a matter of curiosity, what sort of act was Rufus working towards? Something a little more dramatic than his father? Dramatic? Lamort laughed uncertainly. Max's act was dramatic enough. You should have seen him when the time was almost up, and he struggled madly on the throne just to get the audience up. Always made it out. Always. She looked bleakly into nowhere. Of course, I meant in tone. Something a little darker, perhaps. Miss Lamort smiled awkwardly. Oh, I see. This has to do with my stage name? Leonie shrugged and smiled. Horst noticed it wasn't the warmest of smiles. There was something of frozen mercury and razor blades about it. Rufus thinks that stage magic has to keep moving on. If it isn't to stagnate, people want sensation. Why not give it to them? What was Max's view of that? That change is inevitable, but that reaching for it too soon looks desperate, not challenging. The audience can smell desperation. He thought that Rufus was on to something, but its time had not quite come yet. She looked from Leonie to Horst and back, her need to emphasize her sincerity palpable. Max was entirely supportive of Rufus. always has been. He loved his son. They found a quiet corner in which to compare notes. Horst were mainly pictures of goats. "They're the only animal I can draw," he said. "But really, there's little to detect here, isn't there? We still don't have the faintest hint that it isn't what it looks like. A terrible accident. I agree, the ménage between father, son, and beautiful assistant is a tad unusual, but that doesn't mean the old man simply didn't have some wretched luck." "There are 5 possible explanations for what happened on that stage tonight," said Leonie Barrow. "Firstly, it's just as you say. Max Maleficaris simply didn't manage to undo the padlock in time for whatever reason. His concentration was off, he fumbled the lockpick, the apparatus malfunctioned and shot too soon, or a dozen other possibilities. Secondly, that it was suicide, that he deliberately sat there and waited for the sand to tip the balance. Thirdly, that Miss Lamort engineered his death. Fourthly, that Rufus did. I'm considering that they were in cahoots as part and parcel of those possibilities." "Cahoots," said Horst, for no other reason than the word felt nice in his mouth. "And finally, that Max Maleficaris was done to death by person or persons unknown to us at present." "That sounds thorough. Which do you favor?" "I don't know. If we're not sure of motive, or even if there even was a motive, it's hard to bring anything to the perpetrator's door. Method, perhaps. If it was murder and a method is detectable, then that might give us an idea as to the killer's identity." "You're frightfully good at this," said Horst. "You sound just like a real detective." "While we're here, I am a real detective. Try to remember that, Horst." "And I'm the slightly dim sidekick, I know. I didn't mean it as an insult. More, a compliment. You're good at this, Leonie." "If I find out what happened on that stage tonight, then I'll agree. Until then, this is all play acting. Come on, let's do what I should have done right from the beginning and study the crime scene properly. Sherlock Holmes would be furious with me. I can't theorize without data, and I'm a fool to try." The photographer had finished his work and the police were on the point of removing the body by the time Leonie and Horst returned. "Might I crave your indulgence for just a few minutes, Inspector?" Leonie applied the hapless expression and joined hands suggestively, yet not precisely analogous to an attitude of prayer, a combination that worked well on older men in her experience. Her father, at any rate. As a ploy, it seemed to have definite puissance, for paternal relays almost audibly clicked home in Inspector Lamont's head, and he nodded indulgently. 10 minutes, and no more, Miss Barrow. We're keen to wrap this one up for the evening." Leonie thanked him and went straight to business. She examined the body, the coral still thrust through the dead man's heart, the chains and padlock, the lockpick grasped in the cold fingers. Then she briefly looked over the paper screen, pierced by the bolt, and the marks on its reverse side that showed it had been repaired after the previous few times it had been penetrated. Lamont consulted his notebook. "They replace it after about 8 performances on average." 8? Why 8? "That's a week's worth. 1 evening performance a day, matinees on Wednesday and Saturday, no performances on a Sunday, obviously." 8 a week. She checked her pocket diary and found that it was full of notes she had no memory of making. Entries made by the historical version of her that this playhouse of a reality had made for the real her, referring to other people, places, cases. It seemed she was quite busy and quite successful. It made her feel both a fraud and anxious not to let herself down. In several manners of speaking, she swiftly counted the repaired tears and counted 7. This tallied with her diary. It was Saturday evening. Somewhere in that fake city, fake newspapermen were writing up a fake story for fake people to read in the morning. Faithfully followed by Horst, who was developing a craning curiosity to one side and rising on the balls of his feet to a minor art form, Miss Barrow next went to inspect the actual engine of death. It was, she had to admit, a very competently wrought piece of engineering. Behind all the fanciful direction lurking a device of brilliant simplicity built to a very high standard. Everything about it demonstrated forethought, from the steep angles of the sand reservoir to prevent clumping, to the precision bearings on the balance itself, all built into a steel frame that would not admit warping or any other cause for imprecision that might result in the sort of terrible accident that had occurred that evening. "This is the dead man's design?" asked Leonie, sprawling unladylike upon her back to inspect the device's underside. "It was, miss." There was silence for a moment, and the assembled company of men looked just about everywhere but at the pair of ladies' ankles so indecorously exposed as Miss Barrow lay beneath the device like a mechanic beneath a car. Finally, her voice wafted out. "And he built it?" "No, the son, Rufus, is the engineer. He built it." Leonie climbed back to her feet and dusted herself off. "He knows his job. I can't see anything obviously wrong. Or anyway, it might be influenced." She turned her attention to the contents of the scale. It seemed at first her interest would be as brief as her other investigations had perforce to be, yet this time she hesitated. She took a pinch of sand and sprinkled it along one of the prop's horizontal struts. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew, with, to Horst's eye, evident delight, a magnifying glass. This she used to examine the grains for a few seconds. Lamont came over, his indulgent air giving way to professional interest. "Have you found something, miss?" "Possibly." She squinted at the sand through the glass for a few moments more. "Horst!" "At your service." "Would you fetch a fire bucket for me, please?" Nonplussed yet obliging, Horst trotted off into the wings. Presently he re-emerged carrying a battered bucket upon which was helpfully painted the word "Fire." "Thank you." Leonie took a pinch of sand from it and sprinkled it a little further along the same strut. She then spent the next minute examining first one sample and then the other, without saying a word, causing her audience inexpressible frustration. Finally, she stepped away, offering her magnifying glass to the inspector. "Take a look, Lamont. Tell me what you see." Perplexed, the inspector spent a few moments looking at them. "Two samples of sand, miss. Quite different. One is very fine and pale, beige, I suppose you'd call it, and the other has larger grains and more of a red color to it." "And that's all?" "Well, it would be easier if you kept the samples further apart, miss. They've become a bit mixed up with one another." "Take another look." Conscious of his subordinate's eyes upon him, Inspector Lamont's patience was wearing thin. "There's nothing else of note, just that—" He started to say something extraordinarily salty, remembered that there was a lady present, and turned a fierce pejorative into a short collection of nonsense syllables. "I'm a fool! The samples aren't mixed up at all. Well, not by you. The sample from the fire bucket has none of the finer grains, but the sample from the balance is riddled with coarse sand. How is that? Why is that?" For her answer, Leonie probed into the fallen sand on the balance and, pinched neatly between thumb and forefinger, produced a cigarette butt. Horst glanced into the fire bucket. The surface was speckled with similar fag ends. "I would suggest that you find a clumsy stagehand, Inspector. Occam's razor always suggests we should look for incompetence, accidents, and pure rotten luck before assuming conspiracy. I think Maleficarus the Magnificent may very well have been done in by the former." The body had finally been removed while further inquiries had been made. Finally, the unwitting culprit was discovered. a stagehand called Jacoby, who was neither more nor less clumsy than any of his fellows, but neither was he immune to the confoundments of wretched luck. A young man and eager to make a fist of it in the theatre, he had been dismayed that, in stowing away the crossbow device after the previous evening's performance, he had caught the well-built but ungainly frame on a corner and succeeded in spilling much of the sand from the scale pan. Being of a practical mind, he had gathered up as much as he could in a dustpan and put it into an empty bucket he had secured for the job. A good quantity of the sand, however, was lost between the boards, and he was momentarily baffled as to where he might make up the shortfall. Then he remembered the fire buckets that so many of the staff used as convenient ashtrays, and sought one out. The sand hadn't looked exactly the same, but after some stirring, the two types seemed to mix well enough, and he was sure that, thanks to his quick thinking, there would be no trouble. Then Maleficaris the Magnificent had ended up dead, and Jacoby had decided this was the ideal opportunity not to tell anyone about it, because manslaughter can look very bad on a curriculum vitae. "I'm awfully dense, I'm sure," said Horst in a heavy tone of somebody who knows it is his role to be awfully dense and to make the protagonist look terribly clever, but that doesn't mean he has to like it. "But why would mixing the sand change anything?" "You're close to the money already," said Leonie. "It's all about density. You saw that machine. It's a precision piece of engineering. Any change in the way it's operated could affect how long Maleficaris had to perform his escape. The rough sand added to the fine sand the apparatus had been calibrated for was enough to alter the density of the mixture. It made it trigger a little early, not very long, but quickly enough to catch Maleficaris by surprise." "Oh," Horst said, a little underwhelmed. "I'm a little underwhelmed," he said, confirming it. "What about all this backstage drama and jealousy and Rufus being such an utter arse that he can't possibly have done it? He didn't do it. I know, but it shouldn't just have been down to one silly ass of a stagehand, should it?" Leonie shook her head. "Aren't you even slightly impressed that I solved this?" "Of course I am. You're terribly clever. I never said you're not. Just, I was hoping for a little more Sturm and Drang, you know. At the very least, a bit of a 'you may be wondering why I've called you all here today' moment. I'm not disappointed that you solved all this. Just that what you solved turned out to be a silly accident. That boy won't get in trouble, will he?" Nope, it's not. Think about what you know about density and why that doesn't work in this equation. Not from the police. There was no reasonable way he could have known what would happen. His career at the Alhambra might be over, though. She tightened her lips. "You're right. It is a bit underwhelming. I wonder if that's the lesson this place is supposed to teach us." "Perhaps. I still don't understand why we're in such a peculiar place anyway." They had left the theater and were walking along the great thoroughfare in the east. The sky was growing light. At a newsstand they brought an early edition of the local Sunday paper. "The Sepulchre Sentinel?" said Leonie. "This city is called Sepulchre?" Horst wasn't very concerned by that, instead focusing on the headline, "Death on the Stage. Police called his famous magician and escapologist dies in grotesque incident." Inside, the story sailed around the edges of whether the death was accidental or deliberate, but it was clear the reporter was hoping against hope that it was murder by some thrillingly obscure method. "Bad luck, old son," muttered Horst. "You're going to be as disappointed as the rest of us when Lamont does his press announcement." He suddenly became more animated. It could still be murder, you know. What if friend Jacoby knew full well what changing the sand would do? Miss Barrow blew out a breath into the chill air. She was wondering at what point they would be allowed to move on from the sinister city of Sepulture. She had assumed it would be dependent on solving the case, but that did not seem to be so. Perhaps she would have to solve more than one. It's not possible, but it seems very unlikely, she said. Jacoby had a good character and apparently wouldn't say boo to a goose. What would his motive be? He might be a hireling, said Horst, but his enthusiasm for the idea was foundering. From what I saw of the backstage people, there are half a dozen more reliable and more corruptible hands I would have chosen before Jacoby for that job. No, it seems off. I'm sure he didn't do it deliberately. If you say so, oh great detective, I suppose you might be right. If it's all just brought down to the laws of physics like that, it doesn't allow for much uncertainty. No answer came. He turned to find Leonie deeply pensive, inured in a brown study. Why the morbs, leader? I should go back. Insist Lamont actually have those samples tested for density. What you just said about physics, you're right. I've been insufficiently scientific. That rough sand obviously heavier, though. Obviously doesn't butter science's parsnips, Horst. Obviously means you're taking things on faith. Everything should be tested and... She fell silent. As the silence extended uncomfortably, Horst watched her with growing consternation. Her eyes were half shut, and the fingertips of her right hand twitched as if she were enumerating things in her mind. I know what that is, he said slowly. I've seen Johannes do something similar. You're cogitating, aren't you? She made an irked half noise, at least as much hiss as shush at him, and he fell silent. Her eyes opened, and she looked angrily at Horst. Then he saw her anger was directed elsewhere. You were right, she said. I was? Hurrah! Then you were wrong. Well, 1 out of 2 isn't bad. Possibly right and wrong. I've been so muddle-headed. We need to get back to the theater before Inspector Lamont lets everyone go. It wasn't an accident? I don't know yet. But I suspect not. You don't know. Why? What do you think killed Maleficaris? If I'm right... She was already walking quickly back towards the theater. If I'm right, science killed the magician. Miss Leonie Barrow was all business and no chat when she secured readmittance to the building. I'm sorry, she told Lament, but I may have been premature when I suggested the case was solved. If I could beg your indulgence for just a few minutes longer. Inspector Lamont's patience, apparently a plentiful commodity where she was concerned in the usual run of things, was nevertheless beginning to run dry. Miss Barrow, we've been here all night. The sun is very nearly up. We're all tired. Could this perhaps wait? Perhaps it could. But Miss Barrow was subject to an inevitable sense that it should not. The sun was rising. It seemed relevant to the presence of Horst and herself that she should be done before the sun finished doing so. A simple rightness to the time. She did not doubt this feeling. For all her reliance upon the scientific method, she was wise enough to know when science, known science at least, was insufficient to comprehend every possible circumstance. She had personal experience of that which chafed at the boundaries of the known, and did not presume to test it when she was so utterly beyond those boundaries herself. No, she said with certainty. We should resolve this matter immediately, if at all possible. I thought it was already, said Lamont under his breath, but did not argue further, and had everyone of note in the matter brought to the stage prior to finally being released. On reaching the stage, she made her way directly to the crossbow device. The stage around it occupied her interest for the moment. Mr. Curry, these marks upon the stage, they seem semi-permanent. What might be their function? Mr. Curry seemed at least as dismayed as Lamont that the investigation was conspiring to still keep him from his bed, even after he had been assured that all was settled. "They're for the scene shifters, the stagehands, so they know exactly where to put the properties." "Close enough isn't good enough, then." "Heavens, no!" He chortled at the naivete. "They are employed commonly enough, even in the most undemanding of sitting-room comedies, never mind a magician's act. Things must be placed exactly so. Lines of sight and placement of props are of paramount importance." Good, good. What exactly it was, good, she didn't care to share at this juncture. Instead, she said to Horst, "What keeps that flower in your lapel?" Horst wasn't sure he had heard right and raised his eyebrows. I beg your pardon?" "Do you use a pin?" "Well, yes, they tend to—" "May I have it, please?" She held out her hand, and when he didn't immediately oblige her, she beckoned for it impatiently. Beginning to wonder if somehow Johannes had possessed the woman, he handed it over. She examined it briefly, muttered, "Good, good," to herself once more, and then vanished beneath the machine again. There were quiet sounds of tinkering for a second, and then she emerged, startled, to hand the pin back, thought better of it, and put it in her own lapel, while assuring Horst she would return it shortly, and then demanded a balance or scale of some sort. Mr. Curry sent off his stage manager to recover the scales used in a production of The Merchant of Venice the previous year, and everyone stood around in a slightly baffled silence while they were fetched, with the exception of Miss Barrow, who spent the time striding around the stage and alternately examining things with her magnifying glass and glaring at Curry, Rufus Maleficaris, and Althea Lamort. When the scales arrived, Miss Barrow wasted no time in measuring identical volumes of sand out of the fire bucket and from the crossbow device. She snorted with something like disgust at the results and turned to face her audience. "You may," she said without a hint of irony, "be wondering why I've called you all here tonight." Horst was suddenly filled with great admiration for Miss Barrow and a desire for popcorn. "I'm guilty of wasting a lot of time, and I must ask you to forgive me for that. I've been distracted recently. My focus was poor, and it has taken me far too long to understand that has been going on here. Strictly, I ask forgiveness from all but one of you. That person has been furnished with a few extra hours of liberty due to my lack of diligence, and he, or she, should not forgive me, but thank me for that time. Now, to facts. The sand that killed him, it didn't, and if I had thought about it more carefully at the time, that should have been obvious to me without even having to weigh it. I made a silly assumption that the coarse sand must have had a greater density than the fine sand, and so it tripped the crossbow that much earlier. That cannot be so. If we assume that the rock that is the source of the sands has a similar density, then the finer stuff will, if anything, have the higher density. Smaller particles and smoother grains mean smaller air gaps between those grains. This is borne out by the simple weighing you just saw, but even then the difference is minuscule. Even extrapolating to a larger bulk of sand used in the device, we're only looking at an ounce or two. But in an escape time to the second, even that small difference, Lament paused, thinking it through. Of course, even if it made a small difference, it would have been in favor of the deceased. He would have had an extra second or two, not less. Exactly, and there is a further factor. The adulterated sand had already failed to kill him once. Why would it suddenly do so this evening? The matinee performance. Mr. Curry was pleased to join the deductionary clique. Of course, why did the effect go wrong yesterday afternoon if the sand was of such concern? Yes, Miss Barrow's gaze darted from face to face. The sand had nothing to do with the tragedy. There was no accident. Then what is it, Leonie? Miss Barrow? Asked Horst. Murder or suicide? He somehow prevented himself from commenting further that obviously murder would be far more thrilling, so that had his vote. She spat out the word, Murder! Horst strangled down the very nearly overwhelming impulse to clap his hands with glee while shouting, "Huzzah!" And Inspector Lamont looked at the candidates for the crime. "You're suggesting the apparatus was tampered with, I take it?" "It was." "Then that puts Rufus in the clear. He wasn't anywhere near the apparatus. There's no trapdoor or anything in a position to allow him to tamper with it. It's subsequently been checked and found to be operating exactly as it should. And this is the closest he's been permitted since his father's death, so he has no opportunity to remove any traces of sabotage." "That is correct in all but 2 details, Inspector. He was able to get very close to it during the performance. About—" She held up a hand with a thumb and index a couple of inches apart. "Yea, close." "Indeed, his approximation was vital for the illusion to work in all those other performances." "It wasn't an illusion," Miss Lamort was adamant. "You don't understand. It was an escape done by skill alone." "That was the illusion. Max was undoubtedly very practiced and highly competent. But he was also slowing down, and he knew it. You said it yourself, ma'am. You never knew exactly how long the escape would take. It was always more or less the same period, but with a few seconds variation. If the scale was so accurate, how was even that much possible? And how did Max always seem to know exactly when the pan was going to fall and trigger the crossbow? Lamort's voice wavered, unsure as she replayed events in her head, and found her rationalization of events now fell short. "He could see the pan starting to fall." "I think the only time he saw the pan fall unexpectedly was tonight. Previously, he always knew exactly when it would drop." Lamont went to stand by the throne of death and regarded it curiously. "How? He couldn't trigger it himself. There's absolutely no connection between the throne and the mechanism." "There is, and tonight that connection killed him." She looked at Rufus Maleficaris. "Didn't you, Rufus?" "You're fishing," he said evenly. "You're throwing dirt and seeing if anyone reacts." "Not at all. I said the inspector was wrong on 2 details. The first was that you were very close. You were directly beneath the stage, after all. The second was that you left no trace of your involvement." Miss Leonie Barrow took the pin from her lapel. "But you did." Before the gathering, she walked a few steps to the crossbow mechanism. She held the pin up for them all to see, and then she brought it close to the metal pan for the balance mechanism. With a sharp click, whose significance far outweighed its volume, the pin snapped from her hand and stuck to the metal. "It's a magnet," said Horst. "It's magnetized," she corrected him. "The result of its many, many exposures to an electromagnet. One built by his son and used at every performance to trigger the balance at the exact moment his father signaled him to use it." "The struggle," Lamort spoke as if in a reverie. "He'd struggle, slam his feet down, just as he freed himself. It was a signal?" All eyes were on Rufus Maleficaris. He shrugged. "Nice theory. How do you intend proving it?" "These gentlemen," Leonie said, nodding at the police officers, "and I shall be going through your understage workshop in close detail, looking for a suitable bar and the length of wire you undoubtedly spent the time waiting to be interviewed putting back onto a spool. But you know what wire's like, never quite smoothed out perfectly. I should think it would be painfully obvious. Of course, we were never supposed to know what it was we were looking for, were we?" "You can't prove a thing." Rufus seemed bored now. In contrast, Miss Lamort was growing more passionately upset by the second. "Why didn't I know about this? I was in the act. Why was I never told?" Leonie shrugged. "Only Rufus can tell you that now. I would guess it was because Max was trying to impress you. A middle-aged man, pulling off an escape 8 times a week that would terrify younger men. He probably meant to tell you at some point early on, but it became more difficult with every week that went by. After a while, he began to fear that if he told you the one great death-defying moment of the show was as illusionary as all the rest, he would lose your respect. That there was still risk wasn't enough. He would rather face a crossbow quarrel than disappoint you. "Oh, God, Max, you stupid, stupid man!" And she began to weep in exhausted, hopeless little gasps. "Stupid's right," muttered Rufus. He looked around, jagged little reckonings showing in his eyes. If he'd stuck to his word, none of this would have happened. "Well done, Miss Barrow. You deserve your reputation. I thought you were as big a fraud as my father at first, but I have to admit this late rally of yours. I'm impressed. Well, don't you want to know why I did it?" "I know why you did it. And you just filled in the last detail. Your father fronted your act and reduced you to a backstage engineer while he got the plaudits. This was only intended to be for a brief while, wasn't it? A season or two. Then there'd be some grand publicity about the father passing on the mantle, and you were to take over, and he would become the engineer, or perhaps just retire. But then things became complicated. He fell in love with Miss Lamort, and rather more unexpectedly, she fell in love with him. Now he had a new lease on life. Now, a season or two wasn't enough. I have plans, you know." Rufus shook his head. "Had plans? Such plans. A new form of magical theater, more risky, more risque. My father took them all and made them the same as everything else out there. Bland, predictable. He took Athena away and turned her into another pouting assistant, some faint shadows of what I had planned. But becoming safer with every performance. He'd have you in ostrich feathers and sequins by the end of the season, Athena. Just another showgirl." He calmed and looked at Lamont, and he curled his lip. "I was angry. I lost concentration. My fingers slipped and I activated the magnet too early. Just a little too early. It was an accident." "No, it wasn't," said Leonie Barrow. He turned a surly leer upon her. "Prove it." The sun. Horst watched it rise above the busy skyline of municipality and industry, the cold rays of a new day throwing golden light into soot-stained streets. He held his hand up to bathe it in brightness, delighting in how it felt good and how it didn't feel any violent combustion. Is this a gift? Is this some way this place is saying, "You play a blinding, silly ass, Horst. Kudos to you, old man." There was no immediate reply. He looked over to find Leonie Barrow cross-armed and furrow-browed. "For somebody who just solved a pretty tricky crime, you're looking a bit woeful, glorious leader." She looked at him and did not so much shake off the reverie as crawl disconsolately from it. "I failed, though, didn't I? Rufus is right. Nothing can be proved beyond what I demonstrated and what he confessed to. If the police try him for murder, it will all come down to how good the barristers are and just how arrogant he is in front of the jury." "Ha! The British jury, stout yeomen all." "Exactly. A bigger bunch of nincompoops is harder to imagine. Yet, if they let him off with manslaughter instead, who can blame them? There's nothing to suggest premeditation. If he decided even a minute beforehand to kill his father, it's murder. And if he triggered the thing on the spot in a paroxysm of rage, it's manslaughter. If he fumbled and did so while distracted, it's accidental. Only Rufus knows the truth, and his truth will get him off with the lightest charge. The jury will have little choice." "That's the law." "It is. Doesn't feel much like justice, though, does it?" She watched as the sun melted the hoarfrost from along the ridge of a nearby wall. Perhaps that's what this was all about? I don't know. I wonder if we're supposed to move on now, or if we're stuck in Sepulchre for a while. Horst shook his head. I have no idea. I just know I've missed the sun. Also, he said, flexing his hand, I sort of miss being a vampire. I'm feeling very mortal all of a sudden. Weaker. More vulnerable. I'm not sure that I like that. It's what you once were. You'll get back into the swing of it, I'm sure. Yes, but, you know, Johannes is saying he thinks he might be able to cure the vampirism, and I was all, yes, wonderful, about it at the time, but this is making me wonder. He looked to Leonie, troubled and sincere. Before, I was nothing. Not really. I was charming, I suppose, and I like to think I was witty, but so were any number of other fellows. But after what happened to me, things changed. I became special. Unique, even. Not that I'm the only vampire, but I doubt you'd find another quite like me. Miss Barrow nodded. It seemed a likely truth. I helped save the world. That's something, isn't it? But Old Horst couldn't have done it. He'd have been dead in the first 5 minutes. Properly dead. He shielded his eyes to look into the dawn. I missed the sun, but perhaps that's a sacrifice I should make. What do you think? She half laughed. Why are you asking me? Because you're the great detective. She started to laugh again, but then saw there wasn't a glimmer of a smile on his face, and the laugh died. Or at least, hey, great detective. You mean that, don't you? She said it with some wonderment, and perhaps even a little gratitude. I do. You know, Johannes is intelligent, but you're clever. He'd have figured out what was going on with the balance faster. Probably, but that's because he would have focused on the balance and barely spoken to anyone else. He'd have found the method, but he would have been very slow finding the motive, if he found it at all. The great detective. It's sweet of you to say that. She pecked him on the cheek to his mild astonishment. Is that you being honest or charming? Occasionally, I have the opportunity to be both, he said. They watched the sun rise over Sepulchre. And that's the end of chapter 2. I should put ambient rain sounds over the back of the tracks when I record stuff. Sorry, I just thought that. How have I not thought that? Have I done that before? I don't think so. Welp. Yeah, we made it all the way through the chapter. No issues at all. Pretty happy about it. How are we all feeling? Y'all doing good? How'd you enjoy it? No glitches, yeah. So did you enjoy the murder mystery? It's very throwback murder mystery. Disappointed For what reason? I'm very interested to know why you're disappointed. I am of the opinion that Jonathan Howard wrote it intentionally to be disappointing. I think, okay, if I feel like I can pinpoint it. One, because this one was, she's accurate when she says it's a test, right? Here's my theory. Here's what I'm going to posit as my theory, okay? And you can tell me if you agree with this and if that is why you're disappointed or if it's something else. And if it's something else, I'm very interested to for you to try and describe what disappoints you. But here's why it disappoints me. One, it is both. Think of any outcome of this murder mystery, this entire chapter. It would have been disappointing for every potential outcome she listed. If it's an accident, that's disappointing. It's supposed to be a murder because it's not supposed to be an accident. This is a murder. It's clearly a murder. Stop it. And then if it's a stagehand, if the Jacoby theory was initially correct, it would have been the most realistic, but also the most disappointing. Every single one of them is a cliche. Every single one of them would have been a cliche unless it was so far out in left field, like the stagehand is cliche, but also not a cliche at the same time. Every single one of them was culture made to be disappointing. But why this one is disappointing is because think of Leonie's dream, what she wants to do. She wants to be a detective. She wants to do what her father did. She wants to succeed in that field. And now think of a dream that you have in a similar respect. Or if you have no dreams any longer, think of what your dream once was and why you don't have it anymore. Was it because you didn't succeed? Or was it because it wasn't as satisfying as you thought it was? That's why I think it's so disappointing. Because Leonie and Horst are both given what they're most desperate, or what they tell themselves they're most desperate to achieve. Horst doesn't want to be a vampire anymore. Leonie wants to be a detective, desperately. And then she's given a case that she's solved, but will have no satisfying end result. You heard her. It all comes down to the justice system, which is inherently flawed. She's starting to see the cracks in the system to where this iconic career, this experience that she desperately wants to have, she realizes it may not be as great as she thought it was. That the reality is a lot cruder. That the reality is a lot less satisfying than what she'd built up in her head, what she'd fantasized about. And Horst is the same way. Sure, he can have sex and eat a bacon sandwich, but then he'll just go back to being ordinary again. Can he go back to his plain life that he used to have before he was a vampire, now that he's experienced so much? For all his success and all of his parents' praise, he never directly achieved anything. He wasn't good at anything. He was a nobody, really. He was attractive and charismatic, and that was it. And sure, Johannes might hold that against him because, well, Johannes was never praised. Was never the life of the party. But Horst was. And now that's boring to him. Now he has a sense of identity. For once in his life, he feels different. He can achieve more. He can help the people he cares about. And he wants to give that up for sunlight and bacon sandwiches. And now he's starting to realize that maybe being human wasn't all it was cracked up to be either. Bacon wasn't actually as good as he remembered it after he got done with all those sandwiches, was it? Your dreams are all the melting clocks in a Salvador Dali painting. And that's why it's so disappointing. Because nothing's exactly as satisfying as you imagine it to be. And it's disappointing that the ending was so lackluster. That the ending had no good feeling of achieving anything. That's my theory anyway. That's why it's so disappointing to me, in particular. Because I was really looking forward to it when I first read it. And then when I got done, I was like, well, that's not... I mean, there was like some funny moments and Horst being amusing. And then, but still when I got done, I was like, I didn't like it. And after thinking about why I didn't like it for so long, I ironically started to like it more. Because it was more of a representation of culminating a goal that you've thought about for so long and realized that you didn't have as much fun as you thought you were going to. Your achievements don't even directly feel like achievements. It's one gigantic imposter syndrome chapter. It is like being an adult. Art reflects life. So, why not make it more disappointing? Just like life. You know? Anyway, that's why I thought it was disappointing. Anyway, if you have a different opinion, or a different way of phrasing that, or something else that made you feel uncomfortable and disappointed by the end of it, I'm very interested to hear what you thought was disappointing. If you need to take some time to do it, that's fine too. You can write me a little message later telling me, wait for the words to come and then utilize them. I'll still be here. I'm not going anywhere. But that is my theory, and that's why I think when you use literature to escape reality, but then it's terrible. Forget I said that. I'm out of coffee. Am I right? Yeah, because after I read it, I was very confused about why that was so disappointing. And it took me a little bit to pinpoint exactly why I didn't like it as much as I thought I was going to. And after sitting with it for a while, I was like, I think that's it. Yeah. Because from the get, I was like, it's Rufus. It's too ironic to not be Rufus. Rufus. And what you could convene of as a separate timeline, what you could consider a different reality. Rufus tracks Johannes down because he murdered his father, and now we're given another. It's Rufus, right? I knew it from the off. And then the density thing I also got because I did a science experiment in fourth grade about that. That's not. I did a very similar science experiment, and I was like, no, that's actually not true about the density thing. And I knew that from the off. So I was like, it's fucking Rufus. And for a while, I was like, what happens if they fail? Because when I first read it, I was like, are they going to fail? If they fail, do they get trapped in Sepulcher? Forget, like, expelled and never permitted to return. That'd be one thing. What if they can't leave? And so for a long time, I was just, like, reading it. I kept stopping, and I was like, what if they get stuck there? And then by the end of it, I was like, haha, right, I knew it was Rufus. And the satisfaction lasted 0.5 seconds. And then I was like, I really thought Jonathan Howard was going to throw something else at me. I mean, this has been an entire series where the devil plays cribbage, where, you know what I mean? Nyarlathotep hangs out with local idiots for no reason. The moon caught on fire in a chapter, and there's nothing else. There was no other curveball you were going to throw at me? And I was a little upset. And then as I got to the end, I was like, I'm disappointed, actually. And I think that I wasn't so much disappointed with the results of the case as how the case made me feel. And that's sort of where I landed. Yeah, in a world of twists, the biggest twist is that there is none. And the thing is that I already figured it out. And I was still upset, even though I was right. I was upset because I was right. And I think there also is something to be said about that, where you really want to be surprised. And you really want something nuts. And then you don't get it. And then you're like, I actually wanted to be wrong. I would have preferred to have been wrong. Because that would have been more exciting for a second. And those are the reasons. Anyway. Oh, good night. I'm interested in Ray's thoughts in particular. I know Ray is probably not in chat. You can feel free to collate this and send it to me later. It's fine. Collect all of this in a missive and send it to me as one long, like a book report. No. I feel like if I say book report, it's not going to happen. So, just some of your thoughts. I would really appreciate it. Who wants cat facts? Since we made it this far, we haven't made it to cat facts in a hot minute. But we made it to cat facts. It's 10:30. We still got cat facts and a board game to play. And the night is young, as they say. All right. Cat facts. All right. Shisa. The Shisa are guardian lions found on the Ryukyu Islands of Japan. Centuries ago, Ryukyu was the center of its own kingdom, and the guardian lions seem culturally linked with Chinese guardian lions from some overlap in history.
There is also a flavor of local mythology in how the Shisa are designed. Traditionally, the statues come in pairs, one with its mouth open and one with its mouth closed. Locals theorize about which Shisa statue is which gender and what the open and closed mouths mean. If there was ever one true answer, it's lost to history, and there's a picture. It's kind of small, and the lighting's off. I just start putting these cat pictures in the Discord. Cat facts make everybody feel better. I love cat statues because they can rank, like, most cat statues, like, of the ones that I've looked up in relevance to just the stuff in this book, range from looking like terrifying dragon monsters to, like, adorable, like, everything in between. It's great. I love all of them. Sorry, I just had a very weird thought. I was like, I should get a cat statue and put it in my front lawn. Like, and I was like, you can't do that. You rent, idiot. I don't think my landlord would care. He lives in Florida and he's never here. Like, we never signed a pet deposit. And last time he showed up unannounced, he was just like, aw, cute dog. And we were like, thank you. Like, he did nothing. Oh, good night. My landlord. Everybody's landlord lives in Florida. Swiftblood knows all of them, and that's why they don't care. No, I'm joking. I don't think that's accurate. That would be really funny, though. Yeah, good night. How many people are left? I've only, like, we've never even, he doesn't even get on video calls. He, like, just talks to us on the phone every once in a while whenever we have a problem, but almost never. And we always pay our rent on time, so he never, like, calls us or anything like that. But, like, he did show up one time, like, unannounced, and me and Dave were like, who is outside of our house? And he came in, and it was our landlord coming to check on the property. Because his property manager, like, he couldn't get into contact with him for whatever reason. For, like, a long time, like a period of months, and he started to get worried. So he just let his property manager ghost him and then came to check on the property himself just to make sure, like, he knew what was going on. And then he was like, just deal directly with me now. And we were like, okay. So we just mail our rent checks. And he did not care. We've done so much work. We installed a fire pit in the backyard. Like, we planted a whole tree in the front yard. We we built a gate. Like, nothing. Didn't care about any of that. Swiftblood is the landlord. Power of the... Swiftblood is... If Swiftblood is shape-shifting into a middle-aged white man with a receding hairline, that would be... the... You could have just told us it was you, Swiftblood. You didn't have to, like, shapeshift and all that. You didn't have to go to all that trouble. It's just a way for Swiftblood to get names at this point. It's not suspicious if it's an Elise, you know? It's the perfect disguise. That's a really good idea for a character, actually. Either that or a bank loan manager. You get names all the time, no problem. There's no reticence on that thing. You gotta spend your soul to make money, you know what I mean? So, actually, that would be a really good idea. Swift pledge. It's a secret. Of course, that's it. Of course it is. Be an assassin bank manager. Stellar plan, Swiftblood. So tell us, how long was it going to be before you let us know? We figured out your grand plot now. And I'm going to tell you right now. If I make coffee liqueur out of this piece of shit bag of coffee no, I'm joking. It doesn't pan out, I'm coming for you. No. I fucking knew it. Who knew it? Look, just let us in and we'll help. As long as you agree to not... As long as we're off the table, we will provide you with more profit. Capital? How do I say this on TikTok without somebody thinking something weird's going on if they happen to hop in here? No, we'll provide you with more capital if we're off the table. I think that's a generous... in an applicable sense, you would reap more of a reward that way in just sheer amount. What is? Look, if we exchange... Look, I just don't want her to pull up my lease contract. It's okay. It's not my real name anyway. Go ahead. If this coffee liqueur is good, I'm going to have to give some of it to Dad. I don't know how it's going to work out. I was just like, I wonder if I can make Sumatra into something else that I enjoy. It's just too, I don't know. And it's less because it's actually bad. It's more of my tainted memories of Starbucks that have just really put like a psychological impediment and to me enjoying the actual end product of anything. Does that make sense? Thank you. Appreciate it. If there's one thing I do, it's most of the time never trust anyone. I have such a hard time. It's taken Jasmine like 3 years to be my IRL friend. And even now, half the time, reflexively, I'm like, this is my coworker, and she's like, we're friends. And I'm like, oh, right, yes, my friend. And she's like, stop coughing before you say it. It's a real struggle for me personally and mentally. And if there's one person that I chose to trust the least, it would be Swiftblood. And it's hands down. No. Probably not. Probably wouldn't be Swiftblood. If I were to pick one, it would be. No. I'm not going to tell. I'm not going to. Because then they'll be on their guard. Right? It's like Inazuma out my window right now. You can't see it, but it's flashing aggressively purple in the window. It's giving me big Inazuma vibes. And I've been playing entirely too much Genshin, so also a problem. Yeah, it's just, I don't know what is going on here. It's like, it was totally fine earlier until I decided to leave. So I kind of feel like inadvertently I caused this. Like, it was just like fine. And then I was like, I'm gonna leave and go to the post office. And then the second I pulled out the driveway, it started to like just slightly rain. And then by the time I got to the post office, parked, and got ready to open my door, the downfall started. And I was like, of course. Of course. It took 6 hours to download on my phone. It takes up so much memory on the phone, though. That's why I can't have it on my phone. I cannot. I tried to download it on my phone, and I was like, I literally had to delete every single app I'd ever had. And I was like, I can't. This has got to be on another thing, because it's too expensive to use on the phone. It's too crazy, so it's on my PlayStation. So, yes, I believe next book is going to be Peregrines. And I'm pretty happy with it so far. I've read the entirety of the first book, started the second one, having a good, decent time, and I think you all will enjoy it. While also still remaining appropriate enough for TikTok to let me put it on here. I feel like the first time I would try to read anything fucking too iffy, TikTok is gonna just string me up from the rafters. Which I'm amazed we made it through this entire live. That's pretty... Did the stain ever dry up? Oh. The large quantity of wait, did I I don't know who knows about that and who doesn't. I spilled a very large amount of liquor everywhere. And the Miss Peregrine's books were on the desk. Spicy Gatorade, yeah. And it all over the floor, all over the altar cloth, all over the book jack. But it didn't get in the books, really. It just got on the very edge of it. You can't even really see it. But it still made me have like a slight... blood clot. No, I'm joking. It wasn't that bad. But I mentally hemorrhaging. Yeah, we can swap this to VC. Actually, yeah, it's 10:45. We can do that. It's about time. We're doing good. I'm gonna swap you guys so I can take this mic out and actually hear you guys. And I'll talk to you in a minute. Thank you guys for showing up. Always can count on you guys. If you're new here and you don't know what we're doing in here and you want to know, I took the mic out, so hopefully you can still hear me. We do this every Tuesday. I read you a book. It's a really fun time. You can come back. But right now, we're going to leave and go somewhere else. So, this is the end. And if we never see each other again, it's probably for the best. I'm not great. Anyway, later,